Okay, so basically, I hadn't signed into my screen recording service, so that's why it cut me off. So let's pick up. So we've pretty much covered the first two documents. So let's look at the next one, which is the Executive Order 9066, which authorizes the U.S. military to create this war zone, right? And this is the executive order that says that. That basically I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders whom he may from time to time designate, whenever he or any designated commander deems such action necessary or desirable, to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restriction the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion. He says the Secretary of War is authorized to provide for residents of any such area who are excluded therefrom such transportation, food, shelter, and other accommodations as may be necessary in the judgment of the Secretary of War, et cetera, et cetera. And that this shall supersede any designations, that have been made prior. And he also takes other steps to enforce compliance with these restrictions. He authorizes all executive offices to assist the military department. And so what's interesting about this? First off, notice that nowhere in this executive order are Japanese Americans specifically mentioned, right? They're just referred to as persons. So ostensibly, it could include anybody, right? So the issue is that the document, the text itself, does not indicate a bias against Japanese Americans. It's clearly phrased as a national security interest. And yet what we know is that the implications of this executive order lead to Japanese Americans being forcibly removed from their homes, being moved into territories, and basically being treated like criminals and prisoners of war, even though there is no evidence that they had done anything wrong. So I think it's important to kind of recognize that this contrast within the Executive Order 9066, and that you have Japanese Americans that definitely are targeted under this. So there's a real irony, especially if you look at the Atlantic Charter and you think about, the Atlantic Charter, free trade and democracy and all this kind of stuff, and yet. Are we really fulfilling our own democratic needs? In other words, when the rubber hits the road and it's our national security at risk, what are we going to do? So I think that, you can kind of read through that and think about the fact that the text of the document by itself in a vacuum, not knowing anything else, doesn't really look that bad. It makes sense. National security, we're at war, we can do these things. But the practice, the implementation of it, one of the things we should know is that you can create a policy and then you can have policy implications and results that do not necessarily work the way we want it to. And so I think that's, I just think that's kind of interesting. The next one has to do with Harry Truman announcing the bombing of Hiroshima. And here you have him talking about, that we had dropped this atomic bomb, and it's the largest bomb ever. He reaffirms the Japanese started this, but because they have refused to end the war, they've refused to seek negotiation, even though we've been winning, because by 1945, we had been winning for some time. Remember, the turning point of this war is Midway in 1942. It's just a long, hard slog, right? And so the Japanese should have known by 1945 that it was time to give up, but they're not. And so he agrees to drop this bomb. He basically kind of gives you a short history that says, we knew, before 1939 that scientists had studied this. By 1942, we were concerned that the Germans were going to add atomic energy, and that they got the rockets right. And he kind of makes it sound like the Germans, like part of why we developed this weapon was because, oh my gosh, the Germans might have it. And that's definitely part of why we developed the atomic bomb. However, the Germans, it's, now that we can look back and get our hands on all the documents, it's clear that the Germans were not really developing atomic energy, but certainly in 1945, the perception was that they had been thinking about it, right? And so he basically kind of talks about the history of this, how we put all these scientists to work, and how we've created, this kind of this testament to the mobilization, the development, the innovation of America. As I've said before, America's not exceptional except when we're exceptional. And this is certainly one of those moments. And of course, basically that we put all this together, and that we are now ready to build more weapons. And that he says, on July 26th, I issued a warning at Potsdam, and he basically tells the Japanese to surrender or else, that the ultimatum was rejected, and now they understand what the deal is, what can happen, right? And so basically he recommends to Congress an appropriate commission to control the production and use of atomic power. And so basically we have this great big weapon. We, are using it simply because we have to. And he's essentially buried within this statement about the history of this bomb, why we did it, why we built it, and that basically our hand was forced, is this assertion that he's going to try to promote responsible use of it. However, keep in mind that having the ability to make this bomb is a game changer. If you can drop this kind of bomb on somebody without using your troops, that's going to give you a clear advantage in geopolitics and all that kind of stuff. The last document is the Declaration of Independence from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This is from 1945, right? So this is taking place shortly after the Japanese have surrendered. And he sends this back to say, hey, Vietnam wants to be an independent country. And I think it's interesting to recognize, and especially because in our classes, we've already kind of started to introduce the notions of Vietnam and kind of the early actions in Vietnam with the U.S. sending aid and sending advisors and that kind of thing. And to recognize that Ho Chi Minh, who had gone to the Paris Peace Conference, wanted independence after World War I, but didn't get it. Then comes back to Vietnam and really has always advocated for an independent Vietnam. For him, that's what this is about. The idea of communism versus a democracy or capitalistic society, for him, those are secondary concerns. His primary concern is an independent Vietnam. Notice that he pays homage to the American values, that all men are created equal. He even references the Declaration of the French Revolution. So this idea is that the new world order that's emerging out of World War II is a world order that's fundamentally based on American values, right? It's, he's calling attention to that. These are undeniable truths, right? And then he goes into calling out the French for having, oppressed Vietnam, that they have refused to give people their rights, right? That they have, they've built more prisons than schools. They have slain our patriots. They've refused free speech. They have weakened us by forcing us to use opium and alcohol. I don't know that they've forced them to do that, but certainly they've created a system where that was available. So keep in mind that, if you think in terms of the Atlantic Charter that talked about the freedom of people to determine their own destiny, to choose their own form of government, to have that sense of being able to make their own choices, I think that you can see that clearly the French, who are American allies, have largely ignored that. And I think that this is going to be a troublesome question as we move forward and we look more into Vietnam, which is how we basically deny our own essential values in the name of the Cold War, right? And so he's going through kind of explaining very much like the American Declaration of Independence, where we list a series of abuses, right? Things that have happened that would hurt us, and that kind of thing. So you have Ho Chi Minh doing the exact same thing. He basically says that the Vietnamese fought with the French. They helped the French. They helped protect them. That they have fought against the Japanese and all that kind of stuff, right? And that they have tried to be nice. They've tried to play with the Allies and work with the Allies to make things, to free Vietnam from that oppression. And so now, that while they have gotten rid of the Japanese, they still haven't gotten rid of the French, right? And that the Vietnamese people want to create a provisional government and declare themselves an independent nation. And that basically that thanks to their meetings, we are convinced that the Allied Nations, which at Tehran, the Tehran Conference, and San Francisco, the initial meeting of the United Nations, have acknowledged the principles of self-determination and the equality of nations. So this he points out, hey, United States, Great Britain, you have come up with this idea of the United Nations, right? And if that's what we're going to do, you need to acknowledge the independence of Vietnam. And basically, he continues to go on to say that we are determined to promote our own self-determination. And I think that this points out a lot of connections between the rhetoric of World War II. So if you think about, FDR and him, the arsenal of democracy and the four freedoms and the Atlantic Charter and the Tehran Conference and all the things that are said about self-determination and promoting these core American values, it presents a really uncomfortable position when you have in Vietnam somebody who claims to be a communist. Now, the fact that they would choose to reject Vietnamese independence simply because of a label is problematic, especially when our own documents, the Atlantic Charter, said that we were going to respect that. But clearly, if you look at Executive Order 9066, we struggled a little bit with that idea, with, how on earth can we fulfill our values and our national security at the same time? So there's an inherent tension between the things that we say we believe and this world that has been created because of atomic power, this world that has been created because of the tensions with the Soviet Union. And so this has created a very difficult situation for the United States coming out of World War II. So that kind of takes you through chapter 24. I'll record a separate one for chapter 25 and 26. And okay, so that's it.